A lot of developments in Washington. What do you make of it? We'll cover it tonight.
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
I don't know. Depending on who you speak to, the nation is so polarized right now. The term "nothing burger" is the big term now for those who see the special counselor's probe, advancing and not believing a thing preemptively. There are a lot of folks that just have absolutely solid predisposition that anything that comes from that investigation is a witch hunt. And the president, I think, has planted that idea pretty firmly in the minds of at least 30% of America. I think there's a goodly amount of folks who think that this is the beginning of the end for Donald Trump, and then there are those of us in the middle trying to figure out what all this means. So let's get to it tonight. Firstly, just to show you, you've seen enough video of the storm problems that we've had. I feel bad for that homeowner. I do have a tree down. It wasn't quite that big, and it didn't go in that direction. Unfortunately, it went across the neighbor's driveway again. It's good to have good neighbor relations. He had to cut his way out of the driveway just to get to work the other morning, and I will be chainsawing myself this weekend to clean up the mess. But I think all of us are wondering why a storm that had no name, the unknown storm, did so much damage. Schools closed for a couple of days now. The governor reportedly said today at press time, we are taping early in the afternoon, that National Grid was caught flat-footed. Well, I think that's probably true. Why is another question to be answered, and we'll get to that this week. In the meantime, we got to get to the story of the day, right? And Washington is fast and furious. Thankfully, we have Timothy Edgar from the Watson Institute and Brown University, a cybersecurity expert and a terrific political analyst, easy for you to say, here this evening to work it through with us. But here's the latest.
President Trump says the investigation into Russian interference in the election is just a witch hunt. But Monday, his former campaign chairman Paul Manafort and his business associate Rick Gates were accused of hiding tens of millions of dollars in foreign banks while working for pro-Russian political parties in Ukraine. Manafort has been under scrutiny for a while, but the Mueller team sent shockwaves through Washington when it announced Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos pled guilty for lying to the FBI. Papadopoulos is described in court documents as a proactive cooperator, and CBS News has learned there are other sealed indictments with similar case numbers that have already been filed.
If you see one indictment and you've got one guy working for you, there are others.
The White House distanced itself from the indictments, saying they had nothing to do with the president or the campaign.
President Trump said, as Paul Manafort's lawyer said, there was no collusion, and events mentioned took place long before he came to the campaign. Few people knew the young, low-level volunteer named George, who has already proven to be a liar.
He was a volunteer on a council that met once.
On Capitol Hill this afternoon, Facebook, Google, and Twitter are prepared to testify that a Russian group called the Internet Research Agency posted more than 80,000 times that may have reached as many as 126 million Facebook users. Twitter plans to say it closed more than 2,700 accounts linked to the same group.
I got to give Donald Trump credit on one level. He's just going to blast away. Yeah. Right? He's going to blast away on Twitter. He's going to flail and fight at every turn. His belittling of this now pled guilty foreign affairs expert, a young man, by the way. It's funny. He characterizes so much of this as fake news and a witch hunt, yet he excerpts what he wants to from these investigations and uses that which, I don't know, supports his argument vehemently. Right. He picks and chooses, doesn't he?
Well, the biggest problem is that we still don't have a president who's taking seriously the fact that the Russian government engaged in this massive campaign of interference in the 2016 elections. And that's become really clear. We know a lot more about it now. We know they engaged in several different hacks. We know that they engaged in these efforts to influence public opinion through Facebook and Twitter and social media. And really the issue here is I think two. One is there any criminal liability, any more complicity higher up in the chain of the Trump campaign? That's what everyone's focused on. But then there's this broader issue of how do we protect the integrity of our democratic process. And on the first one, the jury is still out on exactly where Donald Trump knew what he knew exactly when. Is there criminal responsibility there? But on the second part, we know he is completely abandoned, completely AWOL when it comes to protecting the integrity of our democratic process.
Okay. I don't even know where to be. I mean, that's a good executive summary and a cliff note on the president. What was your overall take from yesterday's news development?
Well, it didn't surprise me because Robert Mueller is a very experienced and capable prosecutor, obviously former head of the FBI, and that he would come up with this sealed indictment against George Papadopoulos, the foreign policy expert, was really the big news. We already knew that Paul Manafort was going to be indicted at some point, that he had been an unregistered foreign agent, he'd collected millions of dollars in cash. But for Papadopoulos, what we certainly didn't know about him, and the fact that he knew about the stolen emails way back in April, and that's really crucial, that he knew in April of 2016 that the Russian government had stolen, hacked information from the DNC, from the Clinton campaign, or at least related to the Clintons, because that hacking was ongoing for several more months until June. So there's a potential problem there for the Trump officials and the Trump campaign when it comes to criminal responsibility. If they're in on the hacking as it's happening, and we now know that they at least knew about it, then there's definitely more to come from Robert Mueller.
They how much, and they how many?
That's what we don't know. We do know that Papadopoulos was told in late April by this contact, the professor, that the Russian government had dirt on Hillary Clinton and that there were thousands of emails which could only have been hacked. And so the next question is, who did he tell? Was there coordination about the release of the emails from WikiLeaks? If you think about what happened in the timeline here, it was up in July that Trump was then sort of, as he said, joking about, hey, the Russians should find more emails. That means they were talking about it at least. And so there's definitely some elements, they're missing elements here. We don't have, a full-blown indictment against Donald Trump or Trump Jr. or other top officials, but, Robert Mueller's playing his cards close to the vest, and we don't know what other facts there might be, what other cooperating witnesses there might be.
Yeah, we have copious amounts of video here tonight, but it dawns on me as Tim is speaking, and one of them which we do not have is that you may have seen a lot of, which is where the president, in a speech, kind of implores the Russians to find the emails.
That's right.
Which I think, when you look at it, it indicates. I mean, that concept does not come out of the ether.
That's right.
It comes out of some kind of knowledge of things going on.
The Russian government is approaching Trump through several different channels, the Trump campaign, and saying, we are helping, these are things we can do. Do you want to cooperate? And what they're getting from the Trump officials is not, hey, go away. And then the Trump officials go and tell the FBI, you really need to look at this, which is what you would expect from any responsible political campaign. Instead, they're getting, hey, let's play footsie, let's talk a little bit more. Now, did that playing footsie result in, criminality? That's what we don't know from Mueller yet. But we certainly know they didn't do the right thing. And we certainly know that they were at least morally complicit in this activity by the Russians. Whether they were legally complicit or not, we don't know yet.
It's kind of important to break down who did what where. Here's the lawyer for Paul Manafort yesterday after the court proceeding.
There is no evidence that Mr. Manafort or the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government. Well,
actually, the clip that I was hoping to see is that he says President Trump is right.
Yeah. Yeah.
President Trump is right. And it seemed to me to be kind of a message right to Donald Trump about Paul Manafort being kind of his guy.
Right.
Maybe en route for a pardon rather than an argument in the courts, because it seems to me that this case against Manafort is not about witness testimony and the kind of stuff that's more readily refuted in the courts. it's nothing but documents.
That's right, and Paul Manafort has an enormous amount of pressure on him now from that indictment, because they didn't indict him just for this technicality of not registering for lobbying for this Ukrainian political party. They indicted him for money laundering, for tax fraud. Those carry very serious penalties. So he's going to, if he doesn't want to go to jail for a very long time, he's going to have to do something to cut a deal with Mueller. And when it comes to this question of collusion, you know, this is where I think there really is a disconnect between Trump supporters and the most fierce Trump opponents here, which is that, you know, collusion isn't a crime. There's no such thing as collusion in the law. Right. So when he says there's no collusion, that doesn't really mean anything from a legal standpoint. You could say, well, we haven't proven a specific criminal conspiracy involving Donald Trump or some of the top officials other than Manafort, sure. But if you're looking at the broader picture, you know, clearly there is at least an effort to play footsie with the Russian government during the campaign, and that would shock a lot of Americans. But in terms of whether that translates into...
The footsie should be readily apparent now.
Yes, and it was apparent...
And it's not moving the needle when it comes to those who support the president.
That's true, and you know, I think that a lot of people see what they want to see in these kinds of situations, but we still haven't really fully absorbed what we're up against when it comes to Russia and some other governments as well. When it comes to these kinds of cybersecurity issues, you know, they have the ability to use hacking, to use social media in ways that give them a lot more influence in our democratic process than they ever had during the Cold War.
I want to talk about the comparability between this saga and other American involvement in elections vis-a-vis Israel and that kind of a thing in just a second with Tim. In the meantime, I just want to remind you that if you're looking to put your financial world together right in the palm of your hand, Card Valet is an app that you ought to download for and from the Navigant Credit Union. Go to the App Store and download Card Valet and find yourself with every bit of financial information regarding your accounts that you could ever want, and the ability to act on any financial transaction immediately. Online at navigantcu.org, and remember NCUA. It is Navigant Credit Union. Right back with Tim. Stay with us.
We don't need a lengthy investigation to tell us that Trump is ignoring the intelligence community about an urgent threat.
The urgent threat being the Russian intervention into the election. A couple things.
Right.
We'll get to Hillary in a second. You know, I get people who call the radio program and who offer, I think, honest debate over this notion that this is really a red herring, this entire Russian thing, that we have been engaged in the same kind of activity trying to affect other elections across the globe. And what Russia has done to us is no different than what we will do to somebody else.
Well, there's some truth in that, in the sense that we have a very active intelligence community. We engage in covert actions around the world and intelligence gathering around the world. We haven't been on the receiving end of it. And you know, one thing that our government is supposed to do is to protect us against foreign intelligence services and protect our sovereignty. And the fact that we, you know, also engage in aggressive behavior overseas, I think is, you know, kind of a talking point for those who are trying to say that it doesn't matter that we were, you know, interfered with in 2016. Of course it matters. You know, it's a little bit like saying because we have an Air Force, we shouldn't protect ourselves against some foreign country that wants to bomb us. Well, of course we should. You know, whether or not what we're doing is right or not around the world, we need to protect our own country when it comes to other countries who are trying to interfere with our democratic system and our democratic processes, who don't have our best interests at heart. I mean, they certainly don't want to support Trump in order to make America great again.
And speaking of Hillary, I mean, you know, the president has done his best to try to, you know, turn this on her and suggest that throughout the investigation of her. And in fact, John Kelly just last night on Fox News suggested that you know, a special prosecutor would be well worth it to investigate how that dossier generated from the Clinton campaign. A dossier that was originally researched, at least in its infancy, by Republican opposition to Donald Trump. When Trump seized the moment and took the lead in the primary, they said, you know what, enough of this, he's our guy. And it was sold and acquired by Democratic funding mechanisms. And I see that as aggressive opposition research. I don't know where the criminality is in that.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think that's...
You wrote about that.
Yeah, so basically, first of all, the dossier wasn't very important in the decision by the intelligence agencies about the Russian interference campaign.
In fact, it wasn't a headline.
It wasn't
Kevin,
used at all.
We have a headline. There you go. In the Lawfare blog where you make this point. I'm not sure everyone can read that on a small screen, but go ahead. I'm
sorry.
So
that's my former colleague Bob Litt, who's basically saying that the dossier had nothing to do with the intelligence agency's conclusion about Russian hacking and Russian interference in the 2016 campaign. That was opposition research, first by the Republicans against Trump in the primary, and then by the Democrats in the general. And it was essentially a bunch of rumors that a former British spy collected and presented as rumors and said, well, this is what I found out in terms of information. You can do that. It may not be very pretty, but it's not hacking. It's not illegal behavior. We're not talking about money laundering. We're not talking about the kinds of things that Robert Mueller is investigating.
Mueller's got his hand on that dossier, though, and is picking it apart like a turkey on Thanksgiving, trying to figure out what's still fresh and we're true in that.
Sure, and that makes perfect sense, because basically the political opponents of Trump were trying to see if there's, damaging information about his relationship with the Russians. Of course, that's something that the prosecutor, Robert Mueller, is going to be interested in. But there's no allegation, there's no evidence or information that anything involving putting that dossier together was at all illegal. It might have been a sort of scandal mongering, but there's nothing wrong with hiring a private investigator to dig up dirt on your political opponents.
Are you surprised that John Kelly, the chief of staff, has gone this far then to suggest that a special prosecutor ought to be engaged in that particular story?
I'm not so surprised, just because John Kelly, although we saw him as being kind of a stabilizing influence here, is clearly a Trump guy. He's a Trump partisan. He's doing his boss's bidding. He's trying to protect his political interests of the White House. But it is clearly a distraction from the main issue here, which is trying to get to the bottom of what happened with Russian interference in 2016.
All right. There's a lot of suggestion from the White House that this thing is going to wrap up soon. We'll talk about that. And, of course, the whole pardon thing. And/or firing Mueller looms. Stay with us.
That obviously is that's a third rail we can't touch, either firing or pardoning those who are indicted, short-circuiting the process there. That wouldn't be handled well.
Right, that's kind of covering both bases, actually. Jeff Flake, of course, made that major speech in the Senate chamber last week and kind of took himself out of the fight, so to speak. It was kind of like his mic drop moment, right, when it comes to Donald Trump. I don't know if you have a thought as to his relevance now. I mean, it was a significant presentation that he made, but now he falls into the, I don't know, predictability category in terms of what he's going to say, yet he makes an important point, and that is either firing Bob Mueller, the special prosecutor, which is not something that's easily done, and or pardoning those who are now implicated in this ongoing investigation. Neither one of those two things will be received well by Washington. I'm not sure how the general public would receive them. I'm confused to be actually. I've ended my prediction business on anything Trump related.
No, I totally agree. And basically, either of those two steps would be a political firestorm for Trump, certainly inside Washington, and it would also be violating basic norms of how you handle presidential scandals. But we've seen him.
So what, says he, right?
Exactly. We've seen him do that sort of thing before. And it would certainly increase the political pressure on the administration. And in the long run, it's an argument about cover-up, about abuse of power, obstruction of justice. But we never can tell with this president. Certainly, the president does have the legal ability to fire Robert Mueller for cause. And he could trump up a cause, perhaps. And he certainly has.
Cause being what?
There wouldn't be any. That's the thing. You'd have to invent a pretext. And for pardoning, his power to do so is pretty unfettered. It's never been tested this way before. So those are things that I think. The thing that makes all of us nervous is that these attacks on Mueller that we've seen from Trump and others, the kind of witch hunt rhetoric, makes you feel like, well, he's not taking this seriously as an investigation.
Well, here's the thing. I thought about this long and hard. If we have a president who didn't really think he was going to win, and who at the end was as surprised as anybody that he did, and who had a game plan really to advance his business conglomerate by the very exposure that he received winning, and who has the tool of pardoning himself in his box, what is it to fear?
Well,
in terms of how he plays this thing out.
First of all, he isn't going to use something that he doesn't feel like is necessary until he gets to the last resort. But I think there is a legitimate legal argument that he can't pardon himself. The pardon power is very, very broad, but to be a judge in your own case like that and frustrate the judicial system, that's not 100% slam dunk. And so before he does something that aggressive, he better be darn sure that there isn't another alternative that will work, and that it's one of these unprecedented steps where you don't know what the consequences really are going to be until you do it.
He smartly, I thought, went to, the Twitter stuff, he can't help himself. And reportedly, he was not happy, parading around the private residence yesterday watching all the coverage. But he smartly came out talking about tax reform and all the things that we would normally just be debating.
Yeah.
It seems to me that's a wise thing. Do some governing if you can possibly do it. At the same time, Republicans must feel like they're one step forward, two steps back every time they try to get into some kind of comprehensive policy move, because this stuff just keeps hovering around them.
Well, two things I would look at. The first is this, is interfering with their drive to cut taxes. So if this is the one thing that they were supposed to accomplish before the midterm elections, at least that's been delayed and complicated by additional concern around Russia. The other thing is surveillance. Surveillance powers are going to expire at the end of the year, a very important part of Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. There was a lot of activity on the Hill last week about that. We haven't heard a thing about that. Very important to the intelligence community. And so this is another priority that I think is being set back by continued focus on the Russia investigation. And in fact, it's already done so, because it's put some of the Trump supporters in a mind to scale back some of those surveillance powers. So those are areas where, powerful parts of the government, powerful part of the Republican establishment, thinking about tax cuts, or the intelligence community thinking about surveillance, are going to look at Trump and say, because of this chaos, we're not getting the things that we want.
All right, I'll get a half minute or so here. Is this a nothing burger? Does this blow over? Does it feel like an unknown storm, or is this really a hurricane of significance?
Sure.
What do you think?
So, on the issue of crimes, the answer is stay tuned. We don't know. They haven't established on the public record, criminal activity on the part of Trump or Trump Jr. or some other folks. So if you want to call that a nothing burger, that would be fine. But we don't know what's going to happen in the future.
How many times have you been here and we've said that?
Yeah, a lot. Every time, seems like.
We're only 9.5 months in. Appreciate your expertise.
Sure.
Timothy Edgar. Final word when we come back. Stay with us. All of this investigation stuff can be relieved by watching these two teams go at it. As a Yankee fan, it took me a little while to recover from losing to Houston there in Game 7, but between these two teams, it has been incredible. I think Game 5 might have been one of the top 5 games ever played in the history of Major League Baseball. Onward to Game 6. Enjoy it. We'll see you tomorrow at 3 on WPRO and back here tomorrow night. Thanks for watching. Good night.